Please welcome to the stage Daniel Weitzner.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here, and thanks for having me. I feel that my first task is somehow to locate my talk in between, on the one hand, the vision that if I could wrap myself in Marin's polymer and kind of dynamically control my exposure to the world, we would have solved a very practical set of privacy problems. And if we, on the other hand, can sort out the international relations challenges that Nasli's put to us, we would solve the global problems. I want to talk about a set of research initiatives that we have underway that are somehow in between those, that are trying to sort out how we can actually make our systems, both in the small and in the large, be imbued with a greater sense of trustworthiness. And what I want to suggest to you is that to make progress towards this greater sense of trustworthiness, we have to really attend to the significant tensions that we're living with in the information society, tensions that we all feel when we go online and are not sure what's happening, tensions that we live with when we hear, if we listen to the NPR story or read the New York Times story about the latest cyber attack. I'd like to explore with you three tensions that I think produce a sense of mistrust, and that if we can resolve them or make progress on them, will lead to a sense of greater trust. First of all, there's really a cultural tension. I think we're living in a moment where we have simultaneously what I would call a normalization of radical transparency, enormous exposure of personal information, of information about institutions, but at the same time, the sense that what's being done with that information happens inside a black box into which we have no visibility and no sense of accountability. I think that this cultural tension is reinforced by our day-to-day user experiences of many of the systems that we use. On the one hand, we're used to a greater and greater degree of control over personal information about ourselves and about others, but at the same time, a real opacity in how that information is used. And finally, very much as Nasli pointed us to, our political processes, our policy debates about the development of these systems, of these information environments, I think are frankly very poorly served currently by the research that we have about how these systems work, so that we have a very hard time understanding what kind of policy environments we would try to create in order to produce more trustworthy systems. Now, why does trust matter in the internet environment, in the information environment? If any of you were paying attention over the last few years to the Snowden disclosures and some of the international implications of those disclosures for United States-based internet companies, what you'll know is that a number of other countries and companies used the occasion of the threat, the suggestion that the NSA had intruded successfully upon many of the major US-based internet services as a way to say, don't get your email service, don't get your internet service from the United States, get it from Germany. And in fact, just less than a week after the first Snowden disclosures, there were full-page advertisements in the European Wall Street Journal saying, get your email made in Germany. Of course, these ads were brought to you by German internet companies. So trustworthiness on a global basis is a tremendously important property that we're going to have to work hard to build into our environment. Trustworthiness is going to come in a very particular set of ways. As part of the privacy research that we do in my group, we've tried to understand what is it that gives individuals a sense of trustworthiness in the systems, in the applications that we all use. Many of you have the experience, perhaps, of having to click through long privacy policies I'm sure that you're all very carefully reading them and considering whether to accept them or not. A colleague of mine did some sort of simple word counts on some of the major privacy policies of the major internet services, the major applications that we all use. Many of them are actually longer than Hamlet by word count. But here's what we learned from following around, I say that advisedly, from following around users in the way they use certain applications and the way they either shared or didn't share personal information, that whether a user is willing to share personal information is related to two things. Number one, it's related to how much they trust the provider of the application overall, not what they're told about about all the details that are written in the privacy policy. And interestingly enough, the more we told users about what a particular application was doing with their personal information, the less they shared. So these very long policies may not be quite what we need. But what is clearly critical for all the services that we're building is to find a way to imbue a legitimate sense of trust. Now, in my world, one has to pay a lot of attention to Edward Snowden, what I call this normalization of radical transparency is a phenomenon that I think reaches far beyond Snowden. It began with an earlier set of disclosures from Julian Assange, from other government leakers or traitors or whatever you want to call them. Whistleblowers, yes, you could call them whistleblowers. I actually think what we should call them actually is practitioners of civil disobedience, genuinely. All right, there we go. Survey says civil disobedience. I think that's a very thoughtful answer. But we're living in a world where large amounts of information about the institutions that we trust or the institutions that we fear, powerful institutions, will be subject to increasing penetration and increasing disclosure on a very large scale. But what's odd about this is that learning more about these institutions certainly has not increased our sense of trust. In fact, to me, one of the most striking developments, the most striking statements in the entire Snowden saga came early on from the chief judge, Judge Walton, of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. This is the court that supervises the National Security Agency and the other parts of the intelligence community when they conduct surveillance for national security purposes. And the court actually has a fair amount of power and authority over the conduct of these agencies, but the judge said in response to the Snowden disclosures that he has no way whatsoever of telling whether when he issues an order to the NSA or the FBI or any other agency, he has no way of telling whether they're complying with his order or not. So how can we possibly feel a sense of trust in an environment where even the authorities don't know what's going on? At the same time, as I suggested to you, we're also, I think, surrounded by a set of technologies that give us the feeling of far greater individual control over personal information. So much of the data that will become the subject of future privacy and security questions is data that's very close to us. It's produced by our devices, by our watches, by whatever other sort of gizmos we have attached to us. And we have dashboards and control panels and all kinds of things that give us a sense that we can control all of these flows. But at the same time, much of the decision-making that affects all of us as individuals, that is driven by these enormous streams of information over which we appear to have some sense of control of, actually goes on inside a very complicated set of black boxes. In some part because of just extraordinary advances in machine learning and other kinds of data analytics techniques, we have the ability to correlate all sorts of human behaviors to various factors such as creditworthiness or whether you're the right person for a job. And for those of you who know anything about machine learning, what you'll know is that very often those decision-making systems are simply spotting features that appear to correlate one factor with another. They are not systems that explain themselves. They're not systems that say, here's why you should have this job or not have this job. Here's why you're a good credit risk or not. They just say, you look like someone who's a good credit risk, or you look like someone who isn't eligible for this job. So we're living in a very opaque environment in this sense. Policymakers have become aware of the need to imbue this big data environment with a greater sense of trust. Beginning last year, the White House took a very intensive look at the big data privacy questions. They actually came to MIT, asked us to organize a workshop for them to explore some of the underlying big data technologies and understand the privacy implications of those. That process produced a whole policy agenda, which is now being acted upon. One of the interesting findings from that the look at big data policy privacy questions, was a new emphasis on discrimination. Many of us think intuitively of privacy as a question of whether we have control over personal information, a question of how much data is collected about us or not. The White House has encouraged us to think a little bit more about not so much what data is collected, but how data is actually used. In particular, are we being discriminated against in some way based on the use of this data? I think the intuition there is that if people feel they're being discriminated against, they're not going to trust the environments in which they're operating. One of the suggestions that came out of this White House policy review was to stress the importance of what we call accountable systems. That is, can systems when they make determinations about individuals, actually explain themselves? Can we hold both the systems and the institutions that operate them accountable for how decisions are made, for how data is used? This is an area that we've done a lot of work on in my group, and I want to give you just a snapshot of it. And I want to do it by analogy from accountable systems to financial accounting systems. We all understand very well that our entire global economy has a sense of trustworthiness about it because of some, at their heart, relatively simple set of accounting rules that allow us to take a snapshot of the behavior of very complex institutions with enormous budgets like MIT, and be able to look then at a summary of those very complicated set of transactions, look at a financial balance sheet that allows us to assess whether an institution from a financial perspective is doing the right thing or not doing the right thing, how much it's worth, whether we should invest in it, whether there's corruption going on in that organization. And it is through this, it is because of the fact that we've worked out a way to move from an enormously complex set of transactions that would appear in an institution's general ledger to a relatively simple summary in the form of a financial balance sheet, that we have a sense of public trust in our financial markets, in our governments, and in other institutions. What I'd like to suggest to you is that we ought to apply this same concept to develop what we call a personal information balance sheet, an accounting for how personal information is actually used in any given system. This would be an accounting not so much based on the value of that data, but based on the question of whether our personal data is being used consistent with the rules. You know, the National Security Agency, right after the Snowden disclosures, said, don't worry, we're doing all the right things. We're not violating any laws. We're following all the rules. We have lots of people who keep track of it. But they had no way to prove it. They had no way to show it, so no one believed them. Even the judge who I cited didn't believe them. We've done some work in this area called accountable systems, and our emphasis really is on building systems, building decision-making systems that are able to explain themselves in policy terms, that are able to say, if you make a determination that someone is eligible for benefits or not, this is a system that looks at whether a particular service can be provided to an individual. or whether data can be accessed by a certain individual. And we're able to make a determination based on looking at the logs of the data flows in those systems, whether the actions that the system enabled are consistent with a set of rules. We can get an answer whether it's consistent or not. We can also have a detailed explanation. We've built some of these systems in a startup that I'm involved with. We're able to put accountable systems on top of very complex data analytics platforms and give data analysts, people who are working with large volumes of data, for example, in an intelligence context, real-time indication of whether what they're doing with the data at any moment is consistent with all of the legal rules and institutional procedures. We're also able to develop what we call this personal information balance sheet as a way of giving the public confidence that an intelligence agency, a law enforcement agency, an insurance company, any other organization is using the data correctly. Now, what's important about this is that we need a better sense, we need a better way of understanding how our systems behave. If we're going to trust this global information environment, it has to be less opaque. In particular, it has to be less opaque to policymakers who are trying to make decisions about how to govern these systems. What I'd like to suggest to you is that the research that we've done in network security and network architecture helps us to understand the behavior of network systems, of computer systems in the small very well. We can build these systems, they operate at large scale, they function actually remarkably reliably. But when we have difficult policy questions, we also often have a very hard time actually understanding how these systems will behave under pressure. I want to give you one example that was from a personal experience I had when I was working in the government. There was a proposal to enact some changes to copyright law that would make it possible to block access to websites, to foreign websites that were purveying products or services that violated US intellectual property law. And the proposal had something to do with using the Internet domain name system to block access to certain websites. It seemed like a relatively uncontroversial thing to do. There were a lot of intellectual property holders in the United States, movie companies, music companies, other copyright holders who were very concerned that their products, while reasonably well protected inside the United States, were being sold from websites outside the United States beyond the reach of US law. Normally, in the physical world, we deal with that problem at our borders. If we see drugs coming into the United States from some foreign manufacturer that violate US patent rights, we stop them at the border. If we see DVDs, or because we don't have DVDs anymore, but if we see whatever kind of physical manifestations of copyrighted works coming across the border that violate US copyright, we can stop them. But on the internet, of course, we don't exactly have physical borders. We don't have customs formalities that we can use exactly in the same way. So some policymakers got together and said, well, let's use the internet domain name system, the system that translates numerical IP addresses into domain names, MIT.edu, et cetera, that does that translation. Let's use that system to just block access to the foreign websites that are purveying infringing content. And it seemed like a relatively innocent proposal, but a bunch of internet activists, and then later a bunch of very distinguished engineers, some of whom are our colleagues here at MIT, said, if you do this, you will break the internet. Not just that it's a bad idea or that maybe people didn't like the idea of such aggressive copyright enforcement, but that you would break the internet, that the internet would stop working somehow. Now, when you ask people what does it mean to break the internet, how would that actually happen, no one could exactly explain that. But as I said, there's a group of really quite distinguished engineers, many of whom were the original architects of the internet and web infrastructure. And they said that we would somehow risk fragmenting the internet's global domain name system and have other negative technical consequences such that we might have a collapse of this critical part of the internet environment. But what was striking about this was that in all this debate, which went on for several years, there were no engineers who were able to come forward with a model that says, here's how the DNS works at scale, and here's why if you do certain things to it, it might fail. There was no data that we could look at that said, well, we've tried this before, and it has either good consequences or bad consequences. In short, we understand very little about the large-scale systems properties of infrastructures like the internet, and therefore we have an extraordinarily hard time of making good policy, and ultimately we all, I think, walk around with a sense of distrust in this environment because we don't know enough about how it actually works. I'm very happy that this year we're just beginning to launch a new cybersecurity and internet policy research initiative. Nazli's one of my close colleagues in the effort. And our aim is to try to understand these questions, to try to understand how we can actually imbue the internet, cyberspace, this whole information environment that we're in with a greater sense of trustworthiness. And in particular, how can we train the next generation of students, of researchers, of engineers, of policymakers to be able to work on these questions, not just purely from the technical perspective, but also from the perspective of understanding how do we create the right kind of social and legal policy environments to make sure that in fact the systems we have are truly trustworthy. I want to leave you with a final thought. It's actually a suggestion. If you're interested in these issues, go read 1984 again. No, and I'm serious. The reason is not because you should be scared, and actually because I think what you may discover is that 1984 has been grossly misused by most privacy advocates. 1984 has been used to stand for the proposition that technology somehow will be almost independently, or surveillance technology in particular, will be independently an agent of our demise as a society. It will be an agent of the rise of totalitarianism. And I actually think that George Orwell meant to tell us exactly the opposite. What he meant to tell us is that totalitarian societies can abuse technologies, in particular when societies don't understand how those technologies work. That we become less free as individuals, we become less free as societies when we feel victims of our technologies, when we feel subservient to them, when we feel out of control with respect to them. So to control things, we need to understand them. We need to build them so that they work in the way that we want. And once we built them, we need to understand how they function. Read 1984 again. It's actually a beautiful book. If you're like me, you probably hadn't read it since you were in high school or something like that. It's a book that's wasted on the young, in my opinion, because it's really about human frailty and the possibility of freedom that we can all embrace if we do the work to really keep it. So that's your reading assignment. I hope you have a wonderful rest of Tech Day, and thanks for having me.